Hello everyone, this is update for January 24th, 2025, day 1066 of the war, end of the date update. Also catch up for January 23rd and 22nd. I'm going to start with general or macro update and macroeconomic update, and then I'm going to switch to situation on the battlefield in Ukraine. So I'm going to go back to Japan because I think there are important developments happening there. And the first one is that Japanese central bank increased interest rate to 0.5%. This sounds probably for most of us like nothing. It used to be 0.25%, but it's a huge deal for Japan. It's a huge increase. Japan was essentially since late 80s in sort of low interest rate or zero interest rate environment and deflation and so on. And because of the malinvestments that happened there in the 80s and late 70s. And so they were essentially paying price for that. But right now they are running out of capital, which I mentioned many times before, and this is the sign of that. And also, Japanese central bank stated that they will probably continue raising interest rates. Also, that is supported by the CPI inflation in Japan. It's rising, as you can see. The new numbers came, and it's rising pretty quickly from 2.9 to 3.6. And the core, which really means X food and energy, which obviously in some ways it's absurd because we obviously first items that we all need is food and energy. But nevertheless, sort of this is kind of more stable component. I think probably the best way to look at this. So it also went up, but sort of less violently. Let's put this way. And tying this all together, there is numbers for export and import and trade balance. And actually, apologies, it's actually not November, but 2024. So for the entire year, Japan has negative trade balance, which means they exported less than they imported. And goes back to what I was mentioning, that Japan, the business model is broken and needs to be repaired. And it's also related to the fact that Japan essentially wasted its own capital, and now it needs to actually create sort of capital by creating surpluses here. And as you can see, that's obviously not happening yet. The numbers for December looking a little bit better. There is a small positive result. This is in yen, in millions of yens, by the way. So that's looking a little bit better. At the same time, December of 2023 also was positive. So this is not, I would say, it's not a clear-cut sign. Let's put it this way. So this is very clear picture in Japan is that country is running out of capital and the business model is broken and it needs to be sort of reorganized, rebuilt, and increasing interest rates is actually what it needs to do that. So in that way, Japanese central bank is doing actually right thing. What this actually means for the rest of the world is that Japan is not going to be provider of capital. It used to be provider of cheap capital, in particular to the US. So that's not going to be happening, and that will put pressure on interest rates in the US in their sort of upwards direction. It's not the only factor that's influencing, but that's going to be additional factor, an important factor that used to be working. I wouldn't even call it from positive perspective, but from a perspective that would reduce interest rates, especially long-term interest rates in the U.S. And now that support for low interest rates is gone. Now let's actually look at the U.S. There are some numbers there. So first of all, service sector of the economy. It's unclear, but there is a significant slowdown, as you can see, 56 from 56.8 to 52.2 aid. It's still positive. It's still expanding service. It's unclear if this is just something happened one off or this is some kind of change in overall in situation. At the same time, there is some positive sign in manufacturing. It went up and also should be actually green color. But it's now in expansionary territory, which is new. Well, potentially could be new trend. It's again just one data point, and this probably more sort of positive on expectation from the new administration that they will reduce amount of bureaucratic hurdles for manufacturer, and so this is in a way sort of advance credit to the new administration rather than actual change on the ground, because it's very clear that removing all of this bureaucratic red tape is going to take some time. It's not going to happen overnight. Also, want to mention a little bit about the U.S. manufacturing base, and U.S. actually is the second largest manufacturer in the world after China, but quite far behind China. So it's not close to China; it's significantly behind China. And then within the U.S., this is the top manufacturing states, as you can see. California actually surprisingly large manufacturing state, given its amount of bureaucratic hurdles there. That's actually surprising. I think Texas is not surprising, given that it's has fairly low bureaucratic hurdles, and then the rest is more of old sort of historical U.S. manufacturing base, which is sometimes called the Rust Belt. Essentially, it's centered around Midwest and goes all the way to New York State, and then New Carolina is just, I would say, new sort of developments. Now let's actually look at the labor market in the U.S. I haven't done update in a while, so just wanted to look what's going on there, and the two sort of metrics are continuing unemployment claims and then sort of new claims. And the sort of the best way to look at this is the initial claims are sort of freshly laid off people, and continuing, obviously it says that these people remain on unemployment support for a while. So this is sort of more sort of a cumulative number, and this is sort of initial increase. So this is increase for every period in this cumulative number, which is continuing unemployment claims. And in terms of trends, it's clear that slowly but surely U.S. labor market is deteriorating, but it's extremely slow process. So that's why I looked at the current period, which is right now, and I looked from November 9th, 2024 till January 11th, 2025. And then I looked at the same sort of period for the same number a year ago, which is this orange line. So before, let's say, this time around New Year was sort of more or less similar, with some bumps here in early December. But I think it's much more clear the trend is more negative, for current period, in specifically in January. And similar sort of picture is in initial claims. As you can see, they are higher than they used to be a year ago, versus here it's sort of more like less clear picture. Generally speaking, also sort of showing the same idea that the labor market is slowly deteriorating in the U.S. and the picture remains the same once you lose your job, it's really hard to find a job. At the same time, layoffs are they're not large in number; they fairly contained. The other update is U.S. Government debt, so that is on hold, and it's not increasing since slightly before New Year, because U.S. already hit the debt limit, which also the outgoing I think finance minister announced, wrote a letter, and so on. So there will be sort of the right now U.S. is basically using its debit account or cash pile that obviously it has just as a normal way of doing business. You have significant cash pile for you know as a working capital essentially, and so that's what's being used right now. That sort of cash pile is being utilized, and probably there will be debt limit sort of not even I wouldn't say it's going to be a fight, but it's going to look optically negative for the new administration, and that's why new president was attempting to force increase in debt limit while the Biden administration was in power, so that optically it looks like as if the prior administration is responsible for increase in the debt. But this hand grenade was passed on to the new administration, so they will be responsible for that, and there will be probably quite a bit of sort of negative reaction from the people who in the new administration who want fiscal sustainability. So we'll see what happens there, but that's something that's sort of coming up. Now let's switch to the situation in Ukraine. I think what is just strategically, there is pressure from the U.S. on both Ukraine and Russia to have some kind of deal of peace or truce, and the problem is that there is a need for a sustainable solution, not just cover the pressure cooker and sort of kind of like hope that things will stabilize on their own. They will not. The way situation is, it's not going to be, if there is simply the fighting stops where it is. It's absolutely unsustainable situation, and that fighting will erupt back in, let's say, in 3-4 years once the current president is out, essentially, because situation is sort of not in balance, not in equilibrium. Ukraine is not capable in the current form, is not sustainable as a country, and Russia knows that, and they understand that they will sort of rebuild themselves in 3-4 years. They can sort of do the final blow to Ukraine. And Ukraine also realizes that. So both sides understand that the truce is not sustainable, and that's a really problem, and obviously bigger problem for Ukraine, which is in much weaker, much worse situation. And again, it's fault of Ukrainian political leadership. Just nobody to blame. It's responsibility of Ukrainian political class or ruling class, and ultimately, obviously, it's responsibility of people for electing such a political class. At the same time, for Russia, they also They, in the long run, they want all of the Ukraine, and especially what is not acceptable for Russia are any NATO peacekeeping troops, because from Russian perspective, that really means that NATO is occupying Ukraine, and that's actually the whole war is about gaining control over Ukraine for Russia. So they cannot accept that. So so there are these obstacles to this peace agreement, to actual real peace agreement. On the sort of pressure side for Ukraine is very straightforward. U.S. president apparently cutting off any financial support, military support, so basically forcing Ukraine's hand. At the same time, similar situations happening with Russia. There's this oil sanctions, which are probably going to be much more painful for Russia, because essentially Russia probably will be able to sell crude only to places like China. At the same time, China cannot take all of the Russian crude because they need to diversify their own supply. They cannot just rely on one supplier, just from a strategic perspective. So Russia is going to be in a difficult situation, and those sanctions are sort of becoming sort of obvious and visible, and we'll see if actually they do work sometime in mid-March. So until mid-March, Russia will probably not feel really much pressure, but after mid-March or towards the end of the March, there should be quite significant amount of pressure, financial pressure, on Russia, and we'll see how that, if that's going to be effective, essentially, if these sanctions are going to be effective. Um, Potentially they could be, and that's in addition. I think U.S. president also mentioned that he will not hesitate to add sort of more sanctions and make it really painful for Russia, basically cut off economic or financial bloodline for the war, which technically is totally possible. This probably also will increase significantly price of crude oil, because there is no available supply to replace Russia. So we'll see what happens, but I think there is this sort of opposing forces that were at work, and we'll find out what sort of how it's all gonna get resolved in probably next couple of months. Now I'm gonna do walkthrough in a clockwise fashion, and starting from north, Kursk region of Russia. Russian troops continuing their sort of very slow squeeze of Ukrainian forces. No, though, major updates there. The next one is a little bit south, which is north and northeast of Kharkiv. Things here are on pause. Now let's move to north Lugansk front line. Things here are without sort of major negative developments for Ukraine. That's probably the best way to describe situation, because Russian troops are moving slowly everywhere. So the front line is moving sort of in a negative direction for Ukraine. At the same time, Russian troops did not manage to have a major breakthrough and capture this village Kolodezi for now. But it doesn't mean that the situation is stable in the long run. Now let's move south and look at the North Donbass front line. The northern portion remains totally stable, similar to sort of Zaporizhya front line. Nothing is happening here. The southern part is the fighting is really limited to essentially two areas: is western outskirts of Chasiv Yar, where Russian troops finishing the squeeze of Ukrainian forces out of Chasiv Yar, and south of it towards Stupochki, without major advances in the area of Stupochki. But the situation is very clear, moving in a negative direction for Ukraine. in a relatively short period of time, Chasiv Yar is going to be lost. And as I mentioned before, that really means that Russian troops will advance, will basically will have major advance towards Konstantinivka here. Now let's look at the central Donbass front line, where things really the worst for Ukraine, and I would say relatively catastrophic. So I want to mention about Velyka Novosilka. So this was essentially this small town or extremely large village is lost, and it lost in really bad way for Ukraine, where Ukrainian forces were. So I show that sort of peninsular Russian troops managed to actually create like real pocket, not just like sort of textbook pocket, and Ukrainian resistance there ceased to be organized, and basically small groups, some surrendered, some attempted to break through the Russian front lines, and it's obviously, as you can imagine, means extremely high losses for Ukrainian troops. Again, this is completely fault of Ukrainian senior military command, which was essentially giving suicidal orders for this troop in Velyka Novosilka, where they should pull them out from that semi-encirclement, and which they did not do, obviously for political reasons, just not to formally or to push off the loss of Velyka Novosilka. So for as long as possible, and they decided to essentially pay with human lives for this PR thing. The other sort of dangerous development is Russian troops continuing advancing sort of towards Udachne and north of Udachne. Let's actually look a little bit. So this is a little bit more updated map. So as you can see, Russian troops advance quite a bit significantly north of Kotlin, and the other important sort of move is in the western actual direction. So they are approaching this Kogin coal mine, which was used to be super important. At this point, obviously, it's stopped, and they also close to finishing capturing Udachne, which obviously then opens the essentially move west toward Dnipro at that point. And the way it looks right now is that Russian command is not considering Pokrovsk as the main goal, and they fully realize that actually moving west creates much more damage for Ukraine, and it's much more dangerous than actually trying to capture immediately Pokrovsk. They obviously will sort of work on that, but I think the most strategic goal is really moving west as far as possible, which will create sort of much more significant damage to Ukrainian defenses, Ukrainian forces, and actually morale. The other sort of relatively small development is Russian troops managed to capture this intersection here, and they a little bit advanced past that intersection. Otherwise, the rest of the front line here is relatively stable, again, for now. This is sort of essentially the southern part of it, except the area around Velyka Novosilka. I discussed already. Ukrainian troops were encircled. The organized resistance stopped, and basically part of the troops surrendered. Part of the troops attempted to break out with significant losses. Now let's move to Zaporizhya front line. Things here quiet, not much is going on there. And then the final section of the front line is along the Dnipro River. Things here quiet, not much is going on as well. Thanks for watching. Till next time. Bye bye.